Hey guys, thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today we're going to be looking at percent losses in Bitcoin from 90% all the way down to 10%. If you guys like this content, please subscribe to the channel and turn notifications on. And if you like discussing these things, talking about ideas, then check out my Telegram and Discord channels in the description below. And feel free to follow me on Twitter as well. So, one of the things that we looked at the price of Bitcoin in the past, and we looked at the ROI time, and we looked at the time to say double or quadruple, or all the way up to 100x your investment. Well, one of the other ways we can look at this is what is the time needed to realize a certain percent loss on your holdings. So we still have the ROI time, but we're looking at 90% losses. And the way it works is basically if there is a point in time where there is a theoretical previous time, there's a time in the past where you could have bought Bitcoin and you would then be sitting at a 90% loss at that point. So for instance here, if you just scroll up, you can see that you could have seen a 90% loss, basically corresponding to if you had bought way up here. Because Bitcoin got up to a little over $30, and then over here it went down to like $2 or $3, so you could have seen a 90% loss in actually a fairly short amount of time. Because if you look at the time for this band, and you just go all the way over here, it's mostly between say 1 and 200 days, or let's say, we'll say it's between around 100 to 200 days. You could have been experiencing 90% losses had you bought pretty much at this peak, because the peak came pretty quickly. It came and went pretty quickly. So basically, more or less, I imagine most of this is in reference to the peak. So if you had bought up here, how many days would it have taken? Before you would have seen a 90% loss, and you could have seen 90% losses, starting somewhere in here with reference to that peak, and then you would have continued to see 90% losses all the way down. But the time, looking back, would have been going up, because more or less it would have all been with respect to this peak. Because we went from like $10 to $30 and then back down relatively quickly. But the interesting thing is, despite the fact that we saw 90% losses over here, we have not seen them since. Now, 80% losses are somewhat different. So if you look at 80% losses, you can see that we have a band for every market cycle. And the interesting thing is that the time, I guess we don't for sure know that this band isn't going to, continue on out way over here. But the time that we were sitting, at 80% losses seems to be decreasing. So you can see that this band over here, it lasts for the better part of a year. And over here, it only, it maybe lasts for not quite a year. And then over here, it's only lasted a few months. And you could make the case, well, we do have some sporadic data points. Maybe we'll have another band over here if this continues to drop. But we'll have to see if that happens or not. One of the interesting things, though, is if this doesn't come all the way back down, and these are essentially maybe 80% losses are essentially disappearing, which is kind of what I'm thinking is going to happen in the long term as we see annual volatility decrease and Bitcoin become a little bit more stable. So maybe this is representative of the fact that a theoretical future market cycle, we might not see 80% losses. And the reason, or a possible reason for not seeing 80% losses is because I think that the peak market cycle ROI will actually be, it'll continue to decrease. And since the price isn't going as high, then it also probably won't continue to see those, astronomical losses. You can already tell that 90% losses only occurred way over here. And back in before 2012, 80% losses are they do exist, and we might see them again in this market cycle. It's a possibility, but whenever we are at 80% loss, we don't really stick there that long. So historically, that's been a great time to buy. Now, 70% losses, you can see that the time where you could have theoretically been sitting at a 70% loss, it's moving up. But again, you notice that as we go through each market cycle, at least so far, it seems to be reducing. Now, we can't make this definitive claim for this market cycle because if we come down here and we print another part of this band, just a little bit further out, then obviously it's possible that this becomes longer. But it is a potential thesis here is nice to think that, well, what if Bitcoin is stabilizing and maybe we do see 80% losses and 70% losses, but the time at which we sit at those losses is reducing in and of itself. Here is 60% losses, so you can see that 60% losses are certainly more on the cards, and then we have 50%. 50%. Obviously, you can see, say, this band over here. If you had bought, if we just zoom in at this data point here, you can see when Bitcoin went down to say $3,200. If you had bought as little as a month beforehand, you would have been sitting at a 50% loss. So a 50% loss in a month time frame is not unheard of with Bitcoin. But in the past, you could have seen them much sooner. There were 50% losses that happened in just a few days in the past, and over here, it took more than just a few days to see that. So, yet another argument to support the thesis that the percent losses of Bitcoin, while they still might reach those high levels occasionally, they don't stay at those levels. Here are 40% losses. We're not going to spend too much time talking about each one because they're more or less the same. 30% losses. So you can see that 30% losses are fairly normal. If you're in Bitcoin for any extended or even in any short amount of time, there's a good chance you're sitting at a 30% loss. For instance, over here, you would never, you wouldn't be sitting at a 30% loss because Bitcoin went up to a few $1,000s, say $2,000 to $3,000, and it hasn't come all the way back down to that yet. So, with that regard, we've never even seen losses from that standpoint. So, if we continue on, so here are 20% losses, and of course, 10% losses. So, 10% losses are quite ridiculous. Day, it means if you can't handle 10% losses, then Bitcoin is not for you, because you can see that essentially every other day almost is a 10% loss with respect to something. So remember too. Even if Bitcoin were to say get to the point where it were at $500, which I'm not saying it would ever get to that point, but it would always be with the percent loss would be corresponding to over here, not in this region, because it's just looking backward in time, one day at a time, to look at those prices. Obviously, I could have plotted these in the reverse way, where you just look, you take a data point, and then you say, okay, how long would I've had to wait to see an 80% loss, rather than finding the data points where you've already capitulated, essentially, and then looking backward in time. So maybe this is confusing for some people, and I apologize if it is, but it's just a different way to think about some of these concepts, and I did want to go over looking at losses in Bitcoin just because we've experienced them and they're nothing new. I have gotten some questions like, do I ever stop making stuff? It seems like I'm posting something constantly, and the answer is I really don't stop going usually. Let's say there's a Tuesday 7 years ago, I stopped for a few minutes, and that was history. So I just decided, okay, I just got to keep going with the content. Let's just keep producing it. I know you guys are loving it, so I'll try to keep it coming. Now, I probably won't be making daily videos all the time, just because I can't keep up with it. But every 2 or 3 days or so, we'll try to get something out. So again, looking at 10% losses, what this shows obviously is it's a trader's. If you know what you're doing, it's a trader's market. If this volatility with Bitcoin, if you were just to say buy Bitcoin and then you waited for it to go up $1,000 or something and then you just sold it, there's a good chance it's going to go back down. at some point, and then you can rebuy it. I mean, it kind of takes a certain level of discipline to do something like that, because a lot of times if you buy Bitcoin and then it goes up, you don't want to sell, because you want to keep imagining what it might turn into if Bitcoin does keep going up. But if you had, say, a certain percentage of your, a small percentage, let's say, and you bought it, and then when Bitcoin went up some nominal amount, you just sold it, and then you waited for Bitcoin to drop again, and then you just bought again, and you just rinsed and repeated for years and years and years, you can see it probably would have worked out pretty well, considering how frequently, a 10% loss really is. So, I mean, obviously, day to day, you're not seeing 10% losses, but it's all with respect to where Bitcoin was at some point in the past. But again, each of these bands, they're showing, different reference points. So I think it's important to keep in mind that, 10% losses, 20%, 30%, they're fairly common. You'll see 30% losses even in a bull market. I mean, even when you're going up this curve, a lot of these times where the price comes back down, a lot of those times it represents a 30% loss. Whereas 50 and 60% losses really only occur with reference to one of these big runs, or when you'll see these 50 to 60% losses. So clearly we're not in a bull run right now, because the losses that we're seeing we don't really see in bull runs, and also that some of the other indicators we're not really holding like we normally would. And then again, 70% losses, 80%. I mean, you can see as we scroll through these, you can see that as we're moving forward in time, the time that we spend at those losses is decreasing. So if you just look, for the most part, I mean, here you can see these bands. So it's 70%, 80%, 90%. So maybe in the next market cycle, 80% losses won't be a thing anymore. Maybe we'll see 70% losses. I don't know. But just keep these things in mind when you do see losses in Bitcoin. It's all relative. I mean, you wanna be buying obviously where it's pretty far down from an all-time high. It's typically the best time to be buying. And a lot of times when you run up this curve, people will say, "Man, I wish the price of Bitcoin was all the way back down here again." Or I wish when we're up here, people might say, "I wish Bitcoin were $3,000 again." But when it is $3,000, they don't actually want to buy it, because then they're fearful. So again, it's the difference between smart money and dumb money. If you guys like this content and you want to dive in a little bit more, feel free to check out my Patreon page. It's in the description below. It's just patreon.com/intothecryptoverse. So I've started publishing these reports. So one of the things you'll get by being a patron is I do updates, like say on risk analysis and other things that I don't just publish to everyone. So if you really like this stuff and you want to get more, you want to squeeze more out of it, be able to download all the charts, check out the Patreon page, and you can have access to all that stuff. And if you want to get, say, a subscription to Bitcoin letters in the future, say the full edition, then that's just $30, and then Ethereum letters and altcoin letters, that's just $50. Again, I'm going to be publishing abbreviated versions of the reports for free. So if that's good enough for you, it's fine. You don't need to actually buy anything. But if you do want the full thing with all the extensive analysis, then feel free to join. I think that wraps it up for this video. If you guys like this, again, please subscribe to the channel. And we're here. We're at the beginning of 2020. Let's just continue to learn how to analyze these assets. Let's be prepared so that when 2021 gets here, 2022 gets here, it's like we did our homework. We know what to expect, and we're going to be prepared for it. All right, guys, that's it. I will see you next time. Bye.